to talk about what is America, right? And to talk about American culture, it's Black culture in many cases. So we have multiple generations of people who have come of age now who understand that. White people I'm speaking of, who grew up listening to Black music, and through that music they were exposed to things that were not in their normal everyday environment. And as I say, this has been going on for a while now. So I can see a direct connection between those sentiments and more recent protests where people have been schooled in some ways in what it means to be Black in a way that their parents and their grandparents and generations before them were not.
That's Dr. Todd Boyd, aka the Notorious PhD, up next on the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back, and we are back. Here at the All Things Risk podcast, I'm Ben Catania, your host. My job here is to go long form and to help us understand the world and ourselves just a little bit better by looking at things through the lenses of risk and uncertainty. And I'm delighted to bring you a fabulous conversation today about race and popular culture, particularly around what's happened recently in the United States with the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings and protests that followed. And as you'll hear, those things follow an unfortunate string of similar events over the years and sadly, decades. And I wanted to explore these events within some context and also to view them through the lenses of popular culture. So I invited Dr. Todd Boyd, aka the Notorious PhD, onto the podcast. I think he's the perfect guest, and he graciously accepted. If you're new to Dr. Boyd, he is the Katherine and Frank Price Endowed Chair for the Study of Race and Popular Culture at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He is a media commentator, he's an author, producer, a scholar. He's appeared in numerous documentaries, most recently the extremely popular The Last Dance, which was about Michael Jordan's last season with the Chicago Bulls. He's appeared in many others. He has written and produced the cult classic film The Wood, as well as the Netflix documentary At All Costs. His books are numerous. They include the Notorious PhD's Guide to the Superfly 1970s, Young, Black, Rich and Famous, the new H.N.I.C, and you'll have to look up what that stands for, and Am I Black Enough for You? He has written articles for the New York Times, the LA Times, ESPN, The Guardian, amongst others. Dr. Boyd is a pioneer. He developed a new field of study around hip-hop culture, and his work makes these wonderful connections across film, music, sport, fashion, art, and politics. And this is a conversation not only about race and what's happened recently in the United States, which has had an effect globally. It's also a conversation about the importance of culture and how it shapes things in powerful and unseen and sometimes uncertain ways. Dr. Boyd shares a number of fascinating views in both a recent as well as an historical context. And much of that is through the lenses of sport and art, the role of popular culture and how that shapes and changes society and its values. We talk about Muhammad Ali, Colin Kaepernick, the 1980s Detroit Pistons, music, art, and a range of other topics. I think you'll find this interesting, insightful. Actually, I think you'll find it fascinating. Here is Dr. Todd Boyd, the Notorious PhD. Boyd, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So I brought you on. I wanted to speak about, and let's channel Marvin Gaye here, what's going on with regard to the race situation in the United States. And I thought that you would be the perfect person to give us a little bit of historical context, because what's seems to be happening is a point in time, and we can get pessimistic about that, or we can become optimistic about other things that happen. But it's all part of a big historical narrative and context. And maybe given that the murder of George Floyd happened a few weeks ago, and maybe you've had a little bit of time to reflect on what this all means, I'm just wondering if you could maybe start with a bit of historical context with the recent developments.
Well, I think across a very long period of time, we have seen situations involving the police brutality, police killing unarmed individuals, various examples of police engaging with the Black community in ways that can end in death, in ways that can end in abuse, in ways that can end in imprisonment. I was having a conversation with my father many years ago. Father was born in Detroit in 1926, which is somewhat unusual for his generation because most of his peers, their families moved to Detroit from the South after that. But my father was born and raised in Detroit. We were actually driving from Detroit to Los Angeles when I was moving here. This was a very long time ago, in the early 90s. As a matter of fact, it was during the time of the Rodney King beating and later the Rodney King riots. And so it's during this time, 1992, and we're driving across country. My father was really invested in this. He still had images of Route 66 circulating in his mind. And we were talking, and he said to me, back in the 40s, during the era of World War II, my father fought in World War II. The military was still segregated. He said back in the 40s, there was a riot in Detroit because of police brutality. There are the infamous riots in Detroit from 1967. And here I was moving to Los Angeles in 1992, and there were the riots after the Rodney King verdict. Some people like to use the word uprising, and I can appreciate the sort of linguistic politics inherent. I'm using riot just out of familiarity and for descriptive purposes. But my point in telling you that story was, from my father's time in the 1940s through the 1990s, we were making these connections about police brutality and the response to police brutality. Of course, in 1965, you had the Watts riots 3 weeks after the signing of the Voting Rights Act. And so, here it is now, it's 2020. My father is no longer alive. He hadn't been for 10 years. But we're having a conversation. I've had many of these conversations over the last month about what it means. So to me, personally, and then, at a, say, more popular level, we've had instances of police brutality and a response to this for a very, very long time. Some of this might be considered new, but it's really not new if you know history and if you've been around a bit longer, you understand that this is a continuum. And at a certain point, people decide that they're going to respond, that they're not going to let it pass, that they're going to use the opportunity to make a statement. We talk about George Floyd, of course, but there's a long list of names that we have all unfortunately come to learn over the last, 8 years, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, et cetera. I mean, we can call these names off of a list. We can, articulate them. We know them for the wrong reasons. We don't know them because, we knew their humanity or experienced their humanity. We know them because they've been victims of racism in our society. And so I guess for me, a lot of it is similar to what has gone on in the past. And then there are other aspects of it that are especially current.
Can we talk a little bit about what's different in the recent riots, uprising, however you want to call it? What's specific to now?
Well, what I have noticed as different is that a video of Mr. Floyd with a officer's knee in his neck is the sort of thing that, again, if you're black, you have had so many experiences with this. It's not new. But the response to it this time, I found interesting in that a number of the people protesting have been white. And there's something about seeing a black person killed like this to prompt white people to stand up and say things like Black Lives Matter, to actually go out in the street and engage in protest, to be very vocal in efforts about, being anti-racist and calling out their own culture, white culture, and in many cases, the practices and ideas and beliefs of, say, their parents or their grandparents' generation. I think the way racism works in our society, it's such thing that racism, doesn't directly affect white people. And so for a long time, we've had people who may not agree with racism, but they've never been compelled to do anything about it because it just doesn't affect them directly. But now I think we're seeing a generation of people who recognize that it does have some effect on them. If nothing else, they don't want to be associated with police murdering unarmed black individuals. They don't want that stigma. And so, beyond that, I think we're looking at a generational shift. There's a huge split that's going on in the country right now, generationally. It's not unlike what was happening in the late 60s and early 70s. You mentioned Marvin Gaye, what's going on. A lot of that song is about this generational difference. Yes, it's racial. You can break it down according to gender. You can talk about it in terms of economics and class. But you're talking about, a generation of people who have come to accept certain things, and now a newer generation of people who decide that they don't want to accept these things. So this is what I found to be interesting in this particular moment.
Wondering if you could explore the kind of cultural currents that may have created some of that. And I was watching a replay of the Ali Liston 2 fight the other day. They're showing it on television. And to me, Muhammad Ali was this inspirational, transcendent figure, right? And as someone who's I'm in my mid 40s here. Someone in my mid 40s, right? To me, Muhammad Ali is an exalted figure. But I watched that fight and in black and white, and he was booed. And I read about that, but then you watch it and you're like, this is different. Like, this is not the Ali. This is not what I think of when I think of Muhammad Ali. The context was completely different. But I don't know if you think that something has happened between now and then, and if so, what, and what role has popular culture had on that, if anything?
Well, you referenced the 1965 fight between
correct
and Sonny Liston, a fight in a very unusual location, Lewiston, Maine. A lot of controversy around that fight leading up to Lewiston, Maine. After Cassius Clay defeated Sonny Liston in Miami in 1964, and he shook up the world, he announced the next day that he was a member of the Nation of Islam. And sometime thereafter, he changed his name from Cassius Marcellus Clay, his government name, to Muhammad Ali. This is the early 1960s, and if you think America has a acrimonious relationship with Muslims and the Middle East now, there was very, 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 very little knowledge of Islam in America in the early 1960s. The Nation of Islam had gotten some attention because of the visibility of Malcolm X, and now here was Cassius Clay becoming Muhammad Ali. Malcolm X, of course, had been Cassius Clay's guest during his preparation for the fight in Miami. But between 1964, when he became the youngest heavyweight champion ever at the time, to 1965, when he fought Liston in the rematch, a lot of people reacted negatively to his name change. They didn't understand his religious affiliation, and they insisted on calling him Cassius Clay, which he found very offensive. It would be sometime after this when he would announce his opposition to the Vietnam War and his refusal to go. But people, need to understand that the Muhammad Ali that was roundly embraced and celebrated 4 years ago at his funeral was not the Muhammad Ali of the mid-1960s. That's something that came over time. And honestly, the way in which Ali's image was, as I like to say, edited from the mid-1990s forward, we have a different image of Ali than the more historical version of Ali. Also, the outspoken sort of racial justice advocate that Muhammad Ali would become is more pronounced by the 1970s than around the time of the Liston fight. At that time, it's assumed that this is a quirky religion. Some people call it quirky. Some people would call it a cult. A lot of people didn't understand it. A lot of negative associations around it. Malcolm X, of course, would be assassinated in 1965. And so, Muhammad Ali, this black guy who's a member of this organization, the Nation of Islam, fighting in a place called Lewiston, Maine, in a really controversial fight. I mean, it doesn't take much time to watch the fight. It ends so fast. And I have watched that fight numerous times because, the narrative has always been that the fix was in. Sonny Liston has to be one of the worst actors in history. But in watching that fight, you're looking at Ali's legacy at an early point in his career. This would change, but it's a mistake to assume that Muhammad Ali was roundly embraced in the mid-1960s. As a matter of fact, a lot of black people didn't embrace Muhammad Ali. This was a time when the black Christian church was very prominent in black culture. A lot of people rejected his religion. A lot of people didn't like the way he carried himself. They thought he talked too much. He's too boisterous. So, when you look at a historical figure, you have to look at them in time. If we're having this conversation about Muhammad Ali 10 years later, in 1975, it's different. But in 1965, it's still early. And I would suggest that maybe the hippest people embraced him, but not the masses, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm. So and I threw that story out because I just thought those are two snapshots in time, the Ali of, say, the 96 Olympics and the Ali of 1965, and the role of popular culture in shaping views on race is very prominent and important, and a lot has happened. You're a scholar of hip hop, you're a scholar of popular culture and art. So on the one hand, potentially very interested to get your thoughts on what were some of the forces at play, perhaps in shifting views generationally, and what does that mean for your observation about the protests that we've just seen? How do you think some of those cultural forces have kind of shaped perceptions, and maybe we can talk about whether or not that's enough, or that's good, or there's how much more needs to happen?
Back in the 90s, I started advocating for the influence of hip hop culture, the influence of rap music and the broader culture, often known as hip hop. I often said at the time, rap is what you do, hip hop is what you are. So I was paying attention in the 90s to how popular the music had become, particularly amongst white audiences, younger white audiences at the time. So if You look at something like in 1988, MTV began airing Yo MTV Raps. Anybody who had cable anywhere in the U.S. could watch MTV. MTV, of course, had prior to this time not featured black artists on their channel. There was controversy. Michael Jackson would become, groundbreaking in this space. A small handful of others, but black artists weren't really being played. Yo MTV Raps changed that. So it's not as though Yo MTV Raps gave hip hop credibility, but what it did do is give hip hop a platform that was bigger than the one it had already. So I think, for multiple generations now, we have white people who have grown up in America with black music and by extension, black culture at the center of the conversation. This was not the case when I was born. It was not the case as I was growing up, but it became the case during the 1990s. Hip hop culture, black culture in general, you talk about sports, you talk about music, you talk about film and television, fashion, art. America would be a really, really different place if not for the cultural influence of African Americans. It would be boring and tasteless and lacking in flavor. And I say that jokingly, but I'm also serious because America, which likes to advertise itself as a nation of immigrants, has people from all over the world. But there are two groups of people in America who are not immigrants: Native Americans, whose land it was, and black people who were brought here as slaves. So to talk about American culture, at one time you were really talking about Irish culture or Italian culture, perhaps Catholic culture. It's the Black American that helps to define Black music, subsequently American culture. I like to say that, as a descendant of both African Americans and Native Americans, I am a representative of the most American one can be. So if you trace your family's history back to Europe, miss me with all this patriotism and judgment and, boasting about like your country, because I don't see it that way and my ancestors didn't see it that way. So, to talk about what is America, right? And to talk about American culture, it's black culture in many cases. So we have multiple generations of people who have come of age now who understand that. White people I'm speaking of, who grew up listening to black music, and through that music, they were exposed to things that were not in their normal everyday environment. And, as I say, this has been going on, for a while now. So I can see a direct connection between those sentiments and, more recent protests where people have been schooled in some ways in what it means to be black in a way that their parents and their grandparents and generations before them were not. And so culture, when you think about it, music, people enjoy listening to music. It's fun. It's an activity that, people do so willingly, right? Well, when you have something like that operating at a cultural level and somebody's, on their headphones, on their computer, in their car, in their house, and like they choose, I want to listen to this. I want to watch this video. I want to check out this TV show. Like, wow, I like the way that looks. I want to wear these clothes. Those things are operating at a sort of subtle everyday level, but over time they have an impact. And so I think what we've seen are people who have some familiarity with black culture. And it's not as though, just because you listen to rap music that you're somehow enlightened, but it's a start. And it's a connection that if you pursue it leads you into other forms of knowledge. And I think the connection between those examples and people being in the street is something that we can see based on this exposure to black culture that has become so prominent in American society.
So let's also maybe bring sports into this too, because I think that's also another avenue where people enjoy things and get to know athletes. And athletes have a personality that comes through, and particularly in certain sports, but you've looked at basketball a fair bit, and that's another way in which people get influenced. Could we talk a little bit about, and I know you've done scholarly work, well, you've written about hip hop and basketball. And actually, you see that I live in London. There's a park down the road where it's got basketball nets, and you see the kids out there and they're playing basketball. And I don't think that existed 10 years ago, 15 years. It's all like it was all like football, soccer fields.
Well, the game of basketball, I call the black man's gift to the world. Because, when you watch the NBA now, even though, not so much representation of London or Britain, but you have players in the NBA now from virtually all over the world. Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Africa, South America. You've had players from Asia. No other sport in America is like basketball. Like, if you look at American football, Americans play the sport. They play a version of American football in Canada. They call it the CFL, as you're familiar with. But outside of, these two countries, I should say, people aren't playing American football all over the world. As you just said, football, when people use that term, they're usually referring to soccer, right? But basketball, it's different than football. It's different than American football. It's different than American baseball. I mean, to the extent that there are people playing baseball not from America, they're from places that America, took the game to and developed, like the Dominican Republic. So when you look at the NBA now, imagine a guy, from Serbia or one of the former Soviet republics at 18, 19 years old, coming to play in the NBA as a, young guy. His teammates are going to be black. The culture he's going to be exposed to is going to be black. And this guy's going to see America very differently than someone coming from the same place who just sort of integrates in mainstream white society. Basketball, because of the sort of global nature, is a sport that I think of as having this appeal because it lends itself to the other aspects of culture. If you think about stars, the best basketball player at any given moment is always going to be a huge star. Michael Jordan, you can talk about, Kobe Bryant for a time. You can talk about Allen Iverson for a time. And, for the last almost 20 years, you talk about LeBron James, 17 years at least since he's been in the NBA. These guys are icons in America. They're icons globally. When you look at a basketball game, you're not looking at somebody wearing a helmet. You can see their face. Their sneakers are things that people want to buy and wear. There's huge sneaker culture. There's just so many things about the game of basketball. They're playing, hip hop music sometimes in the arena. It lends itself to popular culture, and the debates that often take place in the NBA are debates around race that reflect what's going on in larger society. And I think because of the nature of the population of the NBA, overwhelmingly black and black for a long time, we're not just talking about a league with predominantly black players. We're talking about a league with a predominantly black culture. So the way that, guys greet each other prior to COVID, the way they shake hands, the way they wear their jerseys, and now in the age of social media, players can communicate directly with their fan base. The music they listen to. I remember a couple years ago, there's a rapper out of Detroit, cat named T Grizzly. And LeBron posted something on Instagram from one of his workouts, and he was bumping T Grizzly. And I later saw T Grizzly thank LeBron because by LeBron posting it, so many other people went out and listen to the music and kind of help, blow that particular song up. So NBA players have a lot of reach. They have a lot of influence. The sport itself has a political history. This predominantly black sport that for a time was marginalized, only to become the coolest sport in America and later across the globe. So there are just a lot of examples in the sport that lend itself to issues of race and social justice. And that's why you see now, as they're going into the bubble, these stories about, Black Lives Matter being on the court and certain messages being allowed on jerseys. The sport is tied up with black culture in ways that other sports in America have not been. And I think that's part of its appeal.
Do you think that makes it a little bit easier for, well, I want to bring in Colin Kaepernick into this, and I want to bring athlete activism into the mix. I had an author a couple of years ago during the World Cup talk about corruption in World Cup of soccer, football, and the observation there was that a lot of the players they're not taking stances. They're not making political statements because, well, a variety of reasons. One is money, but also because of, I presume, because of risk. And if you look at what Colin Kaepernick has gone through, you could probably see why. Because if you're an athlete in some sports, and maybe not basketball, maybe this is other sports, but if you take those stances, then you're giving up on a lot of aspects of your career. And I don't know how much of that has changed when you can compare that to what Kaepernick has gone through and what John Carlos and Tommy Smith went through back in 1968 and the price that those guys paid.
Yes, I mean, even Ali, had to sit out,
right.
Sit out 3.5 years at the peak of his, skill level.
And Ali wouldn't have had to do much in the Army, would he? He would have been a PR figure.
Everyone assumes that he would have been treated the way, say, Joe Louis was treated in exhibitions and such things. But he didn't want any part of it. And it turned out he was right. It turned out he was ahead of his time because the protest against the war became more popular after Ali took his stand. But, you look at Muhammad Ali, you look at John Carlos, Tommy Smith, I mean, they were banished after, their protest at the 68 Olympics. You look at guys like, people bring up Craig Hodges, former NBA player, Chicago Bulls, visit to the White House when George H.W. Bush was president, wearing dashiki, sort of non-traditional garb. You look at a guy like the former Chris Jackson, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, the Denver Nuggets. Always speculation as to whether or not, their political views hastened their departure from the league. I remember watching Craig Hodges, who had won 3-point shooting contest at the All-Star game in his last year. He didn't even have a team jersey to wear. He wore like the NBA Players Association practice tank top. It was kind of telling, as the reigning 3-point shooting champion. So you bring that up to a guy like Kaepernick, and I remember it vividly because the day after he, sat down initially during the national anthem, the playing of the national anthem, the day after, I got a series of calls from the NFL network asking me to come on the air and to talk about what it was Kaepernick was doing. And I remember when I got there, there was a lot of nervousness in the building. Like, just people weren't sure how to read everything. And 2 days later, they asked me back, and this time I'm back with Jim Brown. And so, Jim Brown, of course, the legacy of the 1960s and his activism, after having been an incredible running back for the Cleveland Browns. So, Kaepernick eventually talked to someone in the military. After this conversation, he decided to kneel instead of sit down. And, going forward, it took on a life of its own. Kaepernick didn't say much, and in the absence of, his words, I think some other people were able to come in and kind of take control of the narrative and maybe shift it in directions that it didn't need to go, which became a distraction from the overall issue. But if you look at it now, I think Kaepernick's been vindicated. Roger Goodell came out and offered an apology, which is a big deal. A lot of people would like to see Kaepernick back in the NFL, but, of course, there was this announcement a week or so ago that he now has a deal with Disney, that he's going to do his own documentary, and he's going to be, in a position to use the media to advance the things that he wants to advance. And so he lost in terms of the NFL, at least, so far, but I think he won in the larger culture. And this, to me, kind of parallels Ali. For 3.5 years, Ali, he couldn't box. They took his passport. He couldn't travel. He couldn't make a living, really. I mean, he could go speak on college campuses, but that was really about it. Eventually, though, he prevailed at the Supreme Court, and subsequently, he prevailed in the court of public opinion. He was right. And so we have a small group of people in America who get more attention than they deserve. And if they complain about something, people take their complaints seriously. But there was never a real issue with Colin Kaepernick other than some very conservative owners and conservative mouthpieces, suggesting that his right to free speech was different than their own. But as I say, I think in the court of public opinion, all of these people have been proven wrong. And if Colin Kaepernick never takes another snap in the NFL, I still think in the long run, you're going to say that he won because he stood up for his rights. And, if free speech is something that exists in America, it exists for everybody equally. And so to that extent, I think there's no way you're going to be able to look at the Kaepernick situation and see it as anything other than it was. So I think in the long run, Kaepernick, like Ali, has been and will continue to be proven correct.
I know we want to wrap up fairly soon, but I think just this conversation, one of the things it brings home is that to me anyway, is that the role of the arts and sport is actually a lot more powerful than we perhaps give credit to. And when you compare that with, policymakers and politics and whatever else may be happening, is that there is a very strong role, and perhaps the foundational role, that comes from the popular culture and the narratives that are created by it.
Well, culture is so important because, as I say, culture is something we enjoy, or at least we should. I mean, I love listening to music. I mean, I love watching great cinema. Sports is enjoyable. These are things we do, for pleasure. They're leisurely activities. But when you go and participate in the culture, you don't leave the rest of society behind and go do this in some, vacuum. It's not virtual reality sealed off from reality. It's part of society. And so I think, if you go back and look at what's happening in the late 40s, Jackie Robinson getting the opportunity to play Major League Baseball has an impact some, 20 years, 15, 20 years before the civil rights movement fully takes off. Because people watch baseball, and here's a black player for the first time, there's conversation. Some people against it, some people in favor of it. But you're forced to talk about race. Politics may not appeal to as many people. Politics can be tedious, it can be boring, it can be uninteresting. Politics alone might not be so interesting. But if you understand the connections between politics, culture, and society, it's all connected. And so watching a sporting event or listening to music or watching a movie can be as political as watching the nightly news. And so I've always advocated the importance of culture, because American culture is something that has taken on, substantial weight over time. There was a time when America produced tangible goods. I mean, I'm from Detroit. Like, we are the Motor City. I like to, talk shit and say to people, we taught the rest of you, how to live a middle class life. The automobile transformed American society. It's to me, one of the most important cities of the 20th century. But at some point, not as many cars are being built in Detroit. They're being built in other places where the labor is cheaper, et cetera. So when American productivity started declining, when the industrial American economy began shifting to the information-based American economy, culture is information, and culture comes in to assume the same place in society that maybe industrial manufacturing did at a previous time. What do we produce in America now? We produce culture. Music, movies, television, sporting events, etc. So if you understand it that way, you understand the impact that culture can have, even though a lot of uninformed people will say it's just pleasure or leisure activity or maybe not so substantive.
Are you an optimist in spite of everything?
I like to think of myself as a realist.
Okay.
Am I an optimist? Am I a pessimist? I'm interested less in optimism or pessimism and more in what's real. Okay. And so I'm trying to always find the unvarnished truth. I'm looking for something that, is not being spun or, sugar-coated or made to appear different than it really is. So when I look out, at the world, I look at it through the lens of reality. And that means sometimes I'm optimistic and sometimes I'm pessimistic. Sometimes I'm cynical and, sometimes I'm not. But if you take a real approach, and you are willing to see what's there as opposed to, seeing what you want to see, you sometimes arrive at conclusions different than what might be, said at the moment by the masses.
Mm-hmm. Just two real quick things before we just wrap up. I just wanted to sneak this one in here because I know you had a role in The Last Dance, and I thought that Isaiah Thomas got the short end of the stick on that documentary because when you compare some of the things that he has done versus off the court versus perhaps Michael Jordan, Isaiah's done some good things. In addition to being perhaps the best pure point guard in basketball. But I just thought I'd love to get your reaction quick on that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because Isaiah has been dealing with this for a very long time. And honestly, if you go back and look at the history, very famous moment after the 1987 conference finals, Dennis Rodman, of all people, had made comments critical of Larry Bird and suggested that Larry Bird was overrated within the media because he was white. And Isaiah simply co-signed what Rodman said, and then it became this huge controversy. And if you notice the coverage of Isaiah in the media from that time forward, it's often been very negative because Isaiah dared point out, the fact that the overwhelmingly white sports media at the time was talking about Larry Bird in ways that it was, not talking about the black players in the league. Here's the thing. After going to play the Bulls 4 times in the playoffs between 88 and 91, the Bulls in 91, after the Pistons, had gotten old and been to 3 finals and won 2 titles, the Bulls finally won. Isaiah walked off the floor, Lambeer walked off the floor, and, America was ready to embrace Michael Jordan. And you're watching that documentary and it's like, okay, Isaiah walked off the floor and he didn't shake his hand. But, Michael verbally and physically abused individuals. He, said all sorts of things about various people, did all sorts of things that, would be problematic, but it's characterized as he wanted to win. Isaiah wanted to win too. So how are you going to criticize Isaiah and not criticize Mike? There's a double standard there. So, you look at it and Isaiah walked off the floor. And I say to people, if I was on the team, I would have been right there walking off the floor with him. Those games were really, tough Detroit and Chicago is only, 4 hours apart. In a lot of ways, the cities have a lot of similarities and, a lot of movement back and forth, so this was a real rivalry and it was enjoyable. But, this idea that Isaiah is the worst person in the world because he wouldn't shake Michael's hand is silly and ridiculous. It's always been that way. I've been having this conversation ever since it happened, and it's not surprising that that would be the narrative that some people would see. But if you look at Michael, he wasn't a nice guy. Incredible athlete. His career speaks for itself. But he wasn't a nice guy. How do you treat that? Do you look at that and say not being a nice guy led to all this success, or do you look at it for what it is? If you want to win the way he won, you have to be maniacal, perhaps. And that's no different for him than it is anybody else. But this whole judgment about Isaiah was always ridiculous to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I agree with you. All right. Just before we wrap up, for my listeners who have been listening to this, but also maybe a bit troubled by what's been going on, not just in the United States, I've got American listeners, but also here there have been protests, and in the UK there are all sorts of problems with race, as well as elsewhere in Europe and Canada. For my listeners who might want to do something or think about this in a slightly different way, are there any thoughts that you might have?
I've answered that question a lot over the last month.
I'm sure you have, yeah.
What can we do? What can be done? And it's a strange question to me because, I don't know. But my response has been, because if I say I don't know, people know, we want you to give us an answer. It kind of defies this all-knowing position.
By the way, this is one of my favorite responses to a question is I don't think that people say I don't know enough in our society,
I had a interesting conversation with Charles Barkley a couple years ago, and I said that very thing to him. He was saying to me, people come and ask him all these political questions about things that he doesn't know anything about. I said, tell him you don't know. That's what you should do. I don't know. And he's like, wow, okay. It was, a cool conversation to have with him. It's like, just why would you know about, the Academy Awards if you're not participating in it? Just say, I don't know. Keep it moving. So on one hand, I don't know. But on the other hand, this is real simple. But people, you have to educate yourself. It really starts with that, because if you don't know history, you don't know what's going on, then you're susceptible to believe, whatever you're told. So I have said to people read, watch some movies, listen to music, watch some documentaries, educate yourself, learn about what's going on, learn about this history, and then it might make more sense to you why people are, out in the street. But if you don't know and, you're just sort of walking around and open to whatever you're being fed, you might miss the point. So the key is you have to educate yourself, because without that knowledge base, you're susceptible to be led astray. So it's always about knowledge. Knowledge is power. There's a documentary, the Black Power mixtape, made by some Swedish filmmakers, footage of people like Angela Davis and Stokely Carmichael from the 70s. I watched that documentary, and sometimes as I'm watching it, you're listening to people from this era and what they're saying, and it's about knowledge. You gotta educate yourself. You really go back and you're some of these problems that seem new are kind of old. And if you don't, have the background, you're easily influenced. And so, in thinking about a piece like the Black Power mixtape, you have, Questlove and Erykah Badu and Talib Kweli, hip hop artists, commenting about, these historical figures like Stokely and Angela Davis in a film. And I'm like, this is real interesting, because you put it in a context and you look at something like this and it's enjoyable, but you learn something. And there are numerous examples. I mean, people now have so many opportunities, the internet, social media. Information is available to people now in ways it's never been available before. But sometimes I find in this moment when the most information is available, people are dumber as opposed to being smarter. Because if you wade out into all that information and you don't know how to process it, it can be overwhelming. So there's a older gentleman in the documentary, Black Power Mixtape, Elder Micho, owns a bookstore in Harlem, and there's footage, and he's telling a story. The reason I brought it up, he's telling a story about, and the footage must be from the 70s. And he says a group of black guys came to him and they said, they said black power. And he said, no, let me educate you. He goes, black is beautiful, but knowledge is power. And I thought, that's right on time. You know, black is beautiful, but knowledge is power. This is what he said. Knowledge is power. So it starts with knowledge. And if you have that knowledge, if you pursue that knowledge, and it's an ongoing pursuit. I mean, you know, you're seeking enlightenment. It doesn't stop. So you really have to invest yourself in educating yourself and using this as a platform. I like to say, get your mind right. That's really, you know, what it's about.
Right on. That's great. Some really great stuff. I want to be respectful of your time, but before we go, is there anything that you wanted to mention that you don't think we got a chance to? I mean, I feel like I talked to you for hours, but we need to wrap it up. But was there anything that you wanted to mention?
I think we covered it. I talk a lot. I sometimes need not to talk, but I talk a lot, and I try to cover a lot of topics in what I say. You know, as you point out, we could talk a lot longer. We could talk about just the Pistons even, but I think we hit it.
Right on. Dr. Boyd, thank you very much. Much appreciated. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that and got a lot out of it. For me, this conversation underscored the power and the importance of the arts and sport to create change, and to do so in ways that we may not fully understand until much later. And that means that these things can create new perspectives, they can shape our societies, and that also is happening right now. Sport, the arts, fashion, cinema, music, all of these things not only reflect our societies, but they also shape them. And we sometimes don't give these forces the credit that they probably deserve. All right, as usual, check out the show notes. And if you like what you hear, give us a positive rating or a review or a share or a like or a subscribe. All that good stuff helps us out a lot, because if you like the show, chances are other people would too. That's it. We will be back soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.